it going, Andrew? Welcome.
Good afternoon, I guess. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You're good.
Yeah, definitely. Do you want to give us any maybe like little background about the talk, or?
Yeah, I'd love to. So truth be told, because this is reInvent month, I am airing something pre-recorded, but it's still warm. I pre-recorded it like 90 minutes before now because I've been on 2 other talks and panels today. So it's been a pretty busy day for me. So just to keep the energy up, I pre-recorded this session. This is more of kind of like 101 style advice, I would call it, for people who are just like coming to pen testing with some cloudy flavor, because I come from like a sysadmin background, right? So like I didn't start out as like a red teamer or anything. And I've come to learn that people refer to this red team, blue team thing as purple teaming. So I've been basically kind of doing that my whole career. A lot of my background is in identity and access management. So you'll kind of hear some of those themes in here as it relates to cloud, with a little bit of advice there. But I really like blue teaming. I like hardening. I love incident response and forensics. Those are kind of my jam. So it's nice to kind of play a little bit in this community. If you're in the chat, I'd love to see you chat at me or tweet at me during the talk if you have questions. And there's a couple call outs in there. It's like, hey, do we actually need this? Does anybody know about a blueprint or a open source project that fills this need, or should we make something new? Because I think that's one of the things that we're very guilty of, in the security community, is like, it's not made here. I'm always going to make my own thing versus kind of jumping on some other project. So I hope one of the good things that comes out of this is just kind of figuring that out for a couple of these spaces where I think that there is a real need.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds like, so based off the title, preparing for a cloud pen test, do your best preparing for a cloud pen test. It sounds kind of similar to something I did a while back, where I did a pen test apocalypse kind of talk, where I basically talked about like the top 10 things that we would find on pen tests. And then the thing about that is like, it's the best thing for blue teams. It really is. Like, even though like, sharing the top 10 attacks, like that can help pen testers too. But one of the things that I found was like, I've had customers that they're like, oh, that's not working for you, huh? Oh, it's not working, huh? Maybe it's because I watched your talk and I fixed everything you talked about in the talk.
What's your problem to have? That's a great problem.
Yeah.
As a pen tester, you want to have interesting engagements. You don't just want to kind of bang out the top 10 things over and over. And I think that's one of the kind of like the unsung attributes of the pen testers. There are people who are creative enough and crazy enough that they could do any of the jobs, but they chose this specific thing, and they want to work on problems that are interesting and scope that's interesting to the business that they're working for. They don't just want to churn out top 10 findings all day long. Yep. So the more you can do kind of to drive those down in advance, it just sort of helps that individual laser focus on business logic and app logic and the crazy cool way that you mashed up cloud stuff.
So, Andrew, is it Krug or Krug? Is it like...
It's Krug, like
okay. with
an umlaut, but people say it all like wrong all the time, so I don't get it. You can call me whatever you want.
So he's a technical evangelist at Datadog, security engineer specializing in cloud security and identity and access management. Krug also works as a cloud security consultant and started the Threat Response Project, a toolkit for Amazon Web Services, first responders. Krug has been a speaker at Black Hat USA, DerbyCon, and B-Sides PDX. But without further ado, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Once again, I'll be active in the Discord while I'm airing this, and I'm going to go on mute now, and I'm going to start airing the talk. So definitely, I'm sure you'll let me know if it's not coming through. Welcome to the Wild West Hackin Fest Cloud Pen Test Roundup. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy day to be here with me as we walk through some 101 advice on getting started with cloud pen testing. I am Andrew Krug, and as you can see, I come by the Wild West theme here pretty honestly. Grew up in a farming community out here in Oregon. I am currently a security geek at Datadog. I do a lot of speaking on cloud security, particularly with regard to AWS. built a couple of OSS tools that I talk about there in the past, but general advocate for all things security, all things cloud, particularly AWS focused. That fantastic beast there in the frame with me is one of my farm and ranch horses. I like to call him my lead pen tester, though, because he's always breaking out of pens, testing fences, and generally getting into trouble. He's got a partner in crime here as well. She's got a bit of a pen testing streak as well. As you can see here, pretty unpredictable. These two get me thinking a lot about the unexpected. Today, though, we're here to talk about pen test preparation as it relates to 4 specific domains. Now, not all of this is going to be cloud-centric necessarily, but testing in the cloud is relatively similar to data centers with a few exceptions, but we can leverage those exceptions to get a little bit more value out of our pen test engagements. First, though, no talk is complete without thanks. These folks, Adam Mashinchi, Jonathan Helmus, who you'll hear from after me, and Jeff McJunkin, worked a fair bit on the pen test side, more than I do, and I really appreciate their feedback on the talk. So just want to give them a shout out here. Once again, John's up right after this, so definitely don't miss that. So why go to the effort to prepare for a pen test in advance at all? I think one of the biggest factors that's kind of hard for corps that are new to pen testing is actually cost. Depending on engagements, you're likely to spend 5 to 6 figures, and you don't necessarily want to spend that kind of dollars from your security program budget, which is likely limited. I don't know anybody that says they have too much money to do security, and not extract kind of the most value that you can. Second, productivity. Productivity is very important, both when it comes to your pen tester's time and quality of life, but also for your team inside your organization. Kind of the more intentional you can be about these engagements, the better the end result's going to be with regards to your application and your specific stack findings. And finally, there's kind of a reputation aspect to all this. If you're just getting started, or even if you've done this every year, you'll want to kind of normalize this in your security culture. After all, we want the pen test to yield some result, treat it blamelessly, and ultimately use that as a business driver to increase confidence in development and security across your entire company. So let's dive right in here. The first area of focus I want to talk about is your team. And this is kind of one of the non-technical aspects of cloud pen testing. Your team includes your application developers, your security folks, and your extended pen test team, and some even more extended members, which we'll talk about in just a bit. We would be remiss to say that pen tests don't have an impact on these people. And that impact, I find tends to be largely dictated by the type of engagement and the scope of that engagement. Now, you could certainly say that there are more than 2 types of tests, but in my experience, pen testing tends to fall into one of these 2 big baskets: scopeless and scoped exercises. Based on the type of exercise, you'll need to do more work in advance to ensure everyone stays happy and engaged through the length of the red team exercise. Let's talk about the most difficult of these 2 first, and that's the scopeless red team exercise. I think that these can be some of the most fun for pen testers, specifically because there's only an established goal at the end. The landscape's wide open. Sometimes in the red team industry, the things that they're going after are often referred to as crown jewel assets. If you're a software vendor, for example, the target could very well be getting a piece of signed code into a build artifact that's distributed as a final destination. The real key here is that the pen tester, by default, has no privileged position in the organization at the beginning and might use tactics such as spear phishing as a pivot. These engagements tend to be problematic for teams because you can't necessarily read everyone in on when the exercise is occurring due to the fact it's meant to simulate an actual attack. When not managed properly, this can be a bit demoralizing. So just something to be aware of, not necessarily a reason not to do it. For a horse, of course, in a scopeless engagement, the crown jewels always look like access to the hay barn by any means necessary. The second type of engagement, which is a little bit more palatable for teams, is limited to a specific scope. So you might have a single application or application architecture that's being tested as a part of your exercise. These tend to go a little bit easier because often the team can be aware the exercise is taking place, and they can take more of a position of casual observer as the testing occurs. This can be a really great way to begin a pen test program because it builds trust in the effectiveness of these exercises and gives the team a chance to work with a red team. Once you've got a couple of these on the books, you can iterate and mature the scope and length of the exercise. Just to bring it back to our horse example, for a horse, a scoped exercise might involve just trying to breach a single area of weak fence to gain access to a new pasture in order to see if a future more comprehensive escape is available. So final advice on this topic would be to start small with a new pen testing program. Scope the engagements if you're able to, inform and communicate with your stakeholders wherever possible, and if you do decide that you want to do a scopeless engagement, do decide in advance on some criteria for when folks should get brought into the exercise. Great examples from my past experience might be things like a security engineer detecting the test who wasn't read in and accidentally prematurely ending the exercise. Or your pen test team accidentally discovering that you're actually already breached in the course of running the exercise, which of course require a read-in and shutting the exercise down. And if you have any time in advance of doing one of these events, there are a few less time-intensive ways to get teams thinking like a red team with regard to their applications. You can run a game day, do a security-focused sprint. Some people call these tech debt paydowns. Or you can create time and space for security runbook and playbook authoring. The point is really just to get that dialogue started and get the teams thinking a little bit more like red teamers. Now you might be asking where the cloud comes into this. Cloud makes it easier than ever to stamp out new environments in safe ways using technologies like CloudFormation and Terraform. You can quickly and easily stand up a game day in a way that wasn't previously possible in a world where each new environment doesn't involve racking some more compute like a data center reality. The building blocks here, though, are more culture, beginning to encourage a culture of curiosity by telling engineers to go forth, or my personal favorite, go forth and break things. Don't forget, though, your teams are internally and externally are truly your greatest asset. And I can't talk enough really about how important the human side of doing these events really is. The more buy-in you have, the more effective the security strategy with regard to pen tests is going to be. And finally, don't forget your extra extended team, the cloud provider support team. On screen here is just a snippet from AWS's guidance on penetration testing. Some folks are relatively aware of this, but just like billing alarms, this is one of the things that can always use a bit more socializing. For certain types of events that will simulate external attacks or test the security of the cloud, not the security of things in the cloud, you have to notify the provider ahead of time. Otherwise, you risk a false positive detection and potentially, in a worst case, having your instances shut down. I can share from personal experience that this is generally a super easy process to go through with the kind humans in AWS's support group. They're really there to help you be as successful as possible in a pen test. Our next category of discussion is really onboarding. The concept of making it a good experience to get your red team briefed on the scenario, the environment, and how to interact with you over the course of an engagement. The first piece of advice here would be to have a pen tester onboarding process, similar to the onboarding process you would go through for any member of your team. This is going to be a little different depending on the mode of the test, but it's always good to onboard these people like they are part of your core security team. If it's a scope test, you can save time and effort by providing diagrams and recommendations to get access to the privileged positions they'll need to carry out their work. You'll also need some working agreements, things like billing, how to communicate, which we'll discuss more later, and an enumeration of anything that's off limits or out of scope. One thing that I find is often missed here is actually adding the pen tester's IP addresses to exception lists. Depending on your architecture, you might make use of any of these tools on screen to secure an AWS environment. Things like WAF, IAM, and Firewall Manager to mitigate actual threats. You also might have detectors like guard duty or rules within your VPCs to limit the flow of traffic. The last thing you want is to waste time or test the wrong control during a pen test. And this is where a global allow or deny capability comes in. I find it's incredibly helpful to have a global allow list and global deny list that pushes out to every service that maintains a list of IPs. Heck, if you have an on-prem or multi-cloud environment, this can be super helpful. Think of it as your own minimalist version of threat intelligence. And over the course of an exercise, this is advantageous because you want to be able to remove these exceptions globally at the end of an engagement as well. This is one of those things that I haven't found really exists in any cloud native solution, but you can quickly and easily cobble together something and mature it. So if you have a way to produce a list of IPs, you can do something as simple as store them in an S3 bucket and grant access to anyone inside of your AWS account or AWS organization. Then you can push that through PowerShell or your favorite other language out to things like IAM policies, Firewall Manager, WAF, etc. And once you're confident in it and you don't want it running on a desktop anymore, throw a little sprinkle of serverless cron jobs on it, and you've got yourself a pretty great security service for both pen testing and mitigation of threats via that global block list feature. Since this is a problem that doesn't have a defined solution, I'm super interested to hear if you have any references for this that you like. Maybe it's open source, maybe it's your open source, maybe it's somebody else's. Go ahead and tweet at me though with your tools, or tweet at me that you'd like to see one of these things written as a reference example, and I'll do my best to write a blog post about it. And be sure to put your language of choice in there as well. I'm always curious to know for a given community what makes things the most contributable for folks. So let's talk about comms with your pen test team. You might be saying, so what? I can communicate with anyone anytime. You may even be on video calls all day long right now. Don't overlook this though. Imagine that you're a pen tester, and pen testers like to get paid for their work. In order to do that, they actually have to do some pen testing. What we don't want to do, though, is share testing infrastructure with the infrastructure that we use to do billing. VPNs, servers, and boxes that communicate that we use for billing otherwise could be an early indication that a pen test is taking place and not a real threat, and subsequently end the engagement early. So it's super important to make agreements on how you're going to communicate with your pen test team in advance. So definitely make sure that you have these things nailed down ahead of the engagement and try to secure a way to communicate that doesn't disclose the nature of the test early. Which brings us to value extraction. Given the cost in both time and dollars for these events, you want to make sure and get the best results for your dollar. Or as I've heard some people say, a good dollars to awesome ratio. Most of the time, the final deliverable in any pen test is the report. The report canonically details vulnerabilities, recommendations, etc. If it's not in the statement of work, consider asking for the report to minimally include the following categories, especially with regard to security of identity, which can be defined as how systems authenticate each other and how they communicate with the cloud provider's APIs. Also, ask for a list of observable artifacts from the pen tester's perspective. This is generally their personal log of TTPs, techniques, tactics, and procedures, the behaviors that they observe from the environment, and the timestamps, more importantly, of when they observed them. This will help you understand things like if your detections are firing during a pen test, if anyone's looking at them, and give you good material for tabletop exercises and game days to come later on. And I can't really stress the utility of this list of observable artifacts enough. Because the observable artifact list will help you build a kill chain or a means of stopping these types of attacks and mitigations to shut down the path the pen tester took through your infrastructure, which is the point of the exercise in the first place. Here's an example of one. Let's say that your red team was able to disrupt CloudTrail's ability to log API calls using the technique on screen. They set an encryption key to an encryption key in a foreign account for all log data, and then scheduled that key for deletion to cause logs to emit after the key is removed from the foreign account. Provided that we know the timestamp, the blue team can go back after the fact and see what wasn't detected and potentially add something like auto remediation for the specific API verb that was used to mutate a resource inside the environment. A caveat here, though, is that to really leverage that list of artifacts, we need to be able to know that 100% of our logs are high integrity. In most AWS environments, this means corralling all the CloudTrail and CloudWatch logs. And better yet, we'd like those logs to be worm or write once, read many. Another way to say this is really immutable logs. They should provide a perfect custody chain for any events occurring inside the environment during a pen test. And this notably gets talked about a lot in blue team talks about AWS, but what often doesn't get talked about is how to really build infrastructure that makes it impossible to disrupt logging or tamper with the existing set of logs. On screen here is just one example of a pattern that I've seen work, where on the left, we have an application account sending logs to a foreign account or security account via an SNS hook from an S3 bucket. The logs are then written to another S3 bucket using a Lambda function inside of the security tools account, and write access to the security team account is break glass access only, i.e., no one has access to that account without going to a safe and getting out a hardware token. This is an excellent pattern, but it takes a ton of time to set up at scale. If you don't have the time and ability to do that, once again, we can add just a tiny bit of cloud controls to help out and get us some of the way there. Earlier this year, AWS released a global object lock feature, which now turns any new S3 bucket into a write once, read many log sync. In the case where you don't have time, this is a really practical one-button intermediate mitigation for increasing the integrity of your logs. Of course, again, if you've got a really good pattern for this reference, definitely do tweet it at me. This time, use hashtag store all the logs. And if you'd like to see a blog or stream, maybe we'll do a Twitch thing for this one, let me know. Happy to build where building is needed. Let's take a stand on building a big open source log data lake. Logging is a great segue, though, into account level preparation or organization level preparation you want to do in your environment in advance. When we talk about that list of observable artifacts, we did talk about going back after the fact to create a kill chain. We can't do that if we can't track down the right resources. Lambda functions, EC2 instances, and anything really inside of AWS can be pretty ephemeral or temporary. So it's really nice to use something like the tagging feature to ensure that you can really build a story around what's involved. If you've never used tags on resources, they came out as sort of a way to track billing information. And they're just key values associated with resources like cost center, department, could be something like product line. And it's enforceable now using the new features in AWS organizations. And AWS organizations evolved out of the utility to create consolidated billing. If you're not using organizations, now's a really great time to get started, and it's even useful if you're in just one account. There's a pretty cool tool here on screen that's linked And it's an open source free tool that helps you build out AWS organizations' policies to enforce different security controls across one or more of your accounts. But again, just kind of think about that minimum standard for the way that you want to tag things. That way, after your pen test is over, you can go back and track movement through resources across multiple environments, product lines, multi-account for a given threat actor. The caveat here is containers. Though, there's not a really good solution for propagating tag sets down to containers depending on what you're using. Not all environments, EKS, ECS, etc., support propagating tags from the cloud environment. So if you're using one of those, Fargate, ECS, EKS, you might need a second strategy to enforce those tags to correlate later on. Next, do be sure to patch where practical before a pen test. You really don't want to have easy access to the environment anyway, but this can seriously increase the noise that's not specific to your cloud or the application you're testing. If you've got containers, those are pretty easy to patch. You just bump the dependencies and rebuild them. If you're using serverless, there's a variety of ways to repackage and update, including, as of this week now, also adopting containers as part of a serverless strategy. If you have short-lived EC2 instances, it's pretty easy to rebake or repack using your existing development pipeline. But if you have long-running EC2 instances, that can be challenging. One of the best ways I've found to manage patches in this is using the AWS Systems Manager agent. It's basically free and can quickly and easily manage an update across your fleet of systems. Of course, as always, there's third-party solutions as well, just like you would have on-prem. Definitely do patch in advance of the test, though. Patching is easy, and it's going to help you extract more value and focus the pen tester's time on the application logic itself. Make it a challenge for the pen tester. I know that they show up really looking for a good challenge and not just going through top 10s. Finally, I just want to spend a minute talking about identity and access management. A lot of people are calling IAM the last mile for security. You may have heard that, or you may have heard identity referred to as the new perimeter. This is kind of accurate because identity and access management really dictates how resources and users can leverage other resources in the cloud and mutate them. The grammars and controls for these systems in the cloud constantly evolve and are really different per cloud. I see this as a tremendous opportunity for tools and pivots as well inside the environments. For me, the last mile looks a bit more like this, just because there's so many different ways to go about doing good identity and access management. In fact, I'm sure before the end of this week, they'll have released a few more. If there's only a couple of pieces of advice I could give for 10xing your efforts in IAM, I would say that thing one would be to leverage the new tooling called AWS SSO. Get rid of those long-lived developer credentials. This makes it far more difficult for an attacker to pivot using phish credentials or credentials that are leaked to GitHub. AWS SSO is also basically free and now supports hardware tokens like U2F flows and WebAuthn for both the browser and the command line. And that's pretty huge because classically it's been really, really difficult to move developers off of static access and secret key pairs to an SSO flow. If you have good IAM patterns, again, let's keep the interaction going here through the talk. Definitely share them with me. Let me know where you think the gaps are. Let's keep the discussion going. Got a tag for the Hackin Fest Roundup here and IAM tools, the Twitter handles up there. If I have one prediction here, it's that IAM is going to continue to be challenging because as companies move to multi-cloud, the fundamental concepts around identity and the way people bring user identities and machine-to-machine identities get more and more complex. The grammars are different per cloud, and we're still evolving concepts around how to do simple things like machine-to-machine zero trust authentication across these environments. So to wrap things up here, just a tiny bit of closing advice. Pen tests are a great tool to improve your security posture. definitely start small and do iterate along the way. Don't forget to take care of your team inside and outside. And also, just an ounce of preparation goes a really long way when it comes to penetration testing. Here's a couple of links to some other upcoming events I'm doing. There's a complimentary blog there on this very topic on the SNCC blog, devseccon.com. And if you prefer video content at 2 p.m. tomorrow, I'll be doing a Twitch stream recap of all things security with regard to reInvent announcements with Clint Gibler, author of TLDR Sex newsletter. With that, I'll go ahead and take some questions here on pen testing. I think we're wrapped a little early here, but we can take a few questions. Thanks again for coming.
You still here?
I'm still here, though I seem to have lost the ability to share my webcam. I just have this pinwheel thing since I dropped it, which is weird in its weird way. I cannot stop sharing, but I am not sharing.
All right, so what we'll do is just a series of rapid fire questions for Andrew about all the things. And then you can just answer from that voice behind the curtain. That would be good. So Andrew, there was a lot of stuff coming up and you were responding really well on Discord. Was there anything that like stood out to you as a question that you think would be good overall for the people who are not on Discord?
So I think that there was a question that came in. It was a good one. What do you mean when you say basically free instead of actually free for some of these services like Systems Manager? And what I mean is that the use of the service itself is free or no cost, but if you're using adjacent services in the cloud or those trigger adjacent services, it can cost a very low amount of dollars, right? So things like AWS SSO are free in the $0 sense, but depending on how you're provisioning, bringing identities in, if you're making use of simple AD or their managed AD service, you're going to spend some money there.
Yeah, but you run into that in your class, right? Like one of the things that you have people, but everyone creates an AWS account in your class or something like that, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then the number one question is, how much will this cost?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's all the free resources like creating IAM users, that kind of thing. One of the things that I was actually going to ask is in regard to security features, do you see that being something that costs more? Because I know with Azure specifically, buying logging even like on certain things requires you to have some of the higher tier, I guess, like subscriptions.
Yeah, I think this is actually an interesting differentiator for AWS because they try to make the security stuff kind of as accessible and low cost as possible as kind of a market opportunity, right? So kind of offering some equality there where some of the other clouds charge for security services, or there's kind of a premium around enabling more features.
Yeah, that's good. Should be the right way to do it.
They talk about guard duty a lot.
Yeah.
I feel like guard duty is one of those things, like in particular, that gets a bad rap because when you first enable it, it's very low cost, but it can also be kind of noisy. But just like anything, got to tune it. You got to figure out what's meaningful for you and do some rule suppression right out the gate. But it is very low cost for the amount of detection capability that you get. And I wish the people could see my face because during this right now, because I'm smiling as I'm talking about guard duty, because it's one of those things that I kind of waffled on when I was first testing it out. But if you look at some of the anomaly detection that exists for like new IPs or new ASNs for users coming in and using your IAM principles, that's pretty invaluable and hard to implement in a lot of different SIEM platforms.
Someone said I accidentally left my AWS resources running from Bo's class last month for about a month, and it was about $5.
Okay, cool. I'm glad that didn't have like more zeros on it. That's awesome.
Yeah, it costs $5,000. That's how much a month costs, right?
Oh man. Ralph, you've had some run-ups before.
Oh yeah. I did have a scenario where I lost control of some API keys, and I think it was $28,000 in 3 days.
So yeah, it's a real deal.
Who paid that?
Amazon wrote it off.
Ah, okay.
Yep.
Heart attack.
That comes back to Andrew's slide about using SSO and not leaking your keys to
for
GitHub.
sure. Developers are bad too about leaving keys laying around on the floor everywhere. And it's not just developers. I mean, it all it takes is just one key to end up, where it shouldn't be or left over. And so, yeah.
One of the things I was going to ask is in regards to like doing a pen test against an organization. A lot of times, what we look for are those GitHub repos, right? Like we do the recon to try to find any GitHub repos like owned by employees of the organization. So we'll do general recon just to figure out who the employees are, and then go and try to identify any Bitbucket accounts, GitLab, GitHub, and then start looking through the code for keys, right? So one of the questions that comes up is how do you identify, based off of looking at keys, whether or not it's something that the company actually owns and utilizes and is like a company-based resource versus something that's just personal, right? Like, because I mean, anybody can post anything. So what are your thoughts on that, Andrew? Did we lose Andrew? Oh, I think we lost Andrew.
Oh, we did?
Oh, no. Yeah, he's not here.
Oh.
Might be coming back. I got lost. Like all of a sudden, I was like,
the meeting totally just crashed for me, like hard. So apologies. I completely missed that.
Hey, we see you now, though.
You can see me again.
Oh no! So basically, what I was saying is that during pen tests, a lot of times what we'll do is recon up front to identify employees, and then go try to identify any of the GitHub repos owned by those employees. Look through the code for keys. And my question is basically like, one of the things that comes up is how can you identify if it's something that's owned by the company that you're actually tested and it's in scope versus something that's just personal? Like, is there any good way to go about that?
So this is a super interesting problem to solve. And so before I worked at Datadog, I actually worked at Mozilla, which, if you want to talk about a very large software project with lots of open repos, like that's the place to go. And we constantly had problems with this, like not just the AWS level, but just like credential leaks and also trying to prove where those credentials came from. And it's almost like a security automation arms race with things like Truffle Hog to find the credentials in the first place, and then run a call with something like Git caller identity, STS Git caller identity. Is that even an account that we own and we're responsible for, kind of a thing? So I think the best thing, if I was a new organization or if I was giving access to a new company just starting out on GitHub, I would say have some post-commit hooks that do a remedial level of scanning on anything that looks like a credential. And if you do find a credential, try to figure out if it's associated with your accounts. And one of the things that I didn't really hammer home in that presentation as much as I should is that AWS organizations is one of the best heavy-handed controls that you have as a new AWS user to know what account IDs are part of your org and also to restrict things. So being able to correlate like those two lists with a credential, really, really, really helpful. But I can't stress enough too, like just even if you're not using AWS organizations, you don't have pre-commit scanning, using SSO is accessible today in a way that it was not 3 years ago, right? So if we look at the kind of the evolution of single sign-on, it was really, really hard to implement SSO for command line access. And that was always the deal breakers. Devs needed static keys, console users didn't. So you'd have like a finance person coming in to look at bills through SSO, and you'd have devs still with keys to the kingdom, on boxes. That's not how it is today. Like you can even use G Suite as a federated identity provider with G Suite's built-in directory feature to assert role attributes to AWS, or you can use the built-in AWS like lightweight Active Directory thing, and you can get 99% of stuff really behind a very strong form of single sign-on.
That's awesome.
Have you tried setting up any kind secrets management systems with AWS, right? So, I mean, we know we're talking about, the keys and files and stuff, right? That, developers, but, calling those and from some kind of secrets. Have you tried implementing that with anything with AWS? Do they offer service like that?
Oh, yeah. I pretty much use all the secrets provider option, including like HashiCorp Vault. So I find a lot of people who are multi-cloud have use of HashiCorp Vault just because it's vendor agnostic.
Yeah.
And then as far as like native solutions, there's a bunch of them for containerizers like kube secrets and stuff.
Yeah.
But if you're just talking about native options, we kind of saw this evolution of environment variables to environment variables that were encrypted using envelope encryption like AES GCM against KMS keys. And then there was parameter store with secrets, but those had very low rate limits. So you could effectively accidentally denial of service yourself and like serverless and stuff if you're making more than 1,000 calls per second in a fan out. And then Secrets Manager came out. And Secrets Manager is kind of my go-to now if you don't want to maintain infrastructure. And I know it gets kind of some criticism because of the cost per secret to store.
Yeah.
But the rate limit is so high, and the number of versions that you have is also great per secret, that it's always more cost effective than having an outage, and it's always more cost effective than maintaining infrastructure. In my opinion. And I think a lot of people don't know still today, if you're in like a data center reality and a cloud reality, you can actually use your on-prem HSMs to vend KMS keys today. So you can have that entire like cryptographic chain back to your on-prem HSMs if that's a requirement for you. So that's a huge value a lot of the time.
Yeah, I figured AWS had something. I haven't actually played with Secrets Manager on AWS. I have played with that HashiCorp, the Vault, which is pretty cool for, like you said, vendor agnostic, right? But yeah, good stuff.
They're almost identical, actually, in the way that you call them from an API perspective. It's really just like the name of the service, and then table accounts that are a little bit different.
Yeah, I think you can do encryption in flight with HashiCorp, but you probably can do the same thing with AWS too, right? Encrypt that data through the Secrets Manager as you ingest it into something like a database, right?
Yeah, you can get the ciphertext out if you choose to, if you want to propagate that and then decrypt it later. It's just envelopes from a ciphertext perspective. You can do some really cool things with if you're like a cryptography nerd and you want to do some cool things with different encryption contexts and policies around those keys about who can actually decrypt those secrets, and you have single sign-on guarantees. You can start to bury things in the encryption context about the user and the attributes of the user that can actually decrypt those. And that's where it's a very cool story, because you have provable mathematical guarantees, and you also have authentication guarantees at the SSO layer. So you have kind of these multiple levels of auditable controls. And that's just, it's a super good place to be if you can get there.
For sure.
Awesome. Andrew, can I ask you a question in regards to common security issues you see? So what are some of the most interesting, or some of the newer ones you're seeing, most common security issues in regards to AWS pen testing?
I'm going to break that question down and get a bit, which is, what are the most common security issues I see? So I think as a vendor, AWS has done a really awesome job in brand new accounts in encouraging people to sort of get rid of anti-patterns like S3 public bucket access. That said, most of us are not new to AWS, or our accounts are older and they don't have those controls enabled by default. So the most common and least interesting is still just like S3 bucket misconfiguration, which kind of aligns with this year's VDBIR, right?
It's crazy how hard it is to actually go make an S3 bucket public now. It's like it takes like a minimum of like 4 clicks, like 4 checkboxes saying like, I definitely want to make this publicly available on the internet.
Yeah, for new accounts, but for existing accounts that don't have those enabled, or a policy wasn't forced at the organization's level, it's still really, really easy to make a mistake, both in policy generation and also in just like making files public on accident. And you wouldn't believe how many examples on Stack Overflow actually have the XAMZN public ACL header in like a curl example of how to post a thing to an S3 bucket, and people just copy and paste those into bash scripts all day. So if you don't have guardrails, that continues to be a significant issue. The other one I really see that a lot of people miss often in audits, and a lot of audit tools miss, is actually SNS topic and SQSQ policies. So we have kind of this family of things that have been in AWS forever, right? And they have kind of a legacy IAM grammar on top of them. And it's easy to accidentally grant cross-account access, which is an anti-pattern that we've seen, since the early days of Active Directory, right? Ever since we had this concept of authenticated users and everyone, which often means like any Active Directory domain that has trust in any way. Well, in AWS, that means any account that has trust in any way, which is all of AWS. The same problem is notably replicated by default in GCP, where you can pretty much make any resource accidentally public to like the entirety of GCP or G Suite users.
Reminds me of Active Directory when you're just giving that permission to all users or just everyone, just right off the top, but even higher than that because it would be outside the organization entirely.
Yeah. So I think it's just kind of one of the things I continue to say is most important for security and often overlooked is UX, like the user experience of security tools and UIs. And I think that we spend far too little time as an industry thinking of all the ways that somebody could use a control wrong, especially with regard to access lists and sanity checks there. But we continue to see these anti-patterns kind of being replicated since like the 90s,
I did want to mention that Dan DeClose is here. Yeah, and we're at that point. So, Bo, if there was any final questions you had for Andrew, and then we're going to transition chit-chat with Dan for a little bit, and then move on to our next speaker.
Yeah, one final question, Andrew. What are some of your favorite books you recommend?
Well, I've recently been reading through Jonathan Helmus's recently released Pentesting book. I was able to get early preview of that, full of practical advice and tools. And Julian Behent, former colleague of mine from Mozilla, his book Securing DevOps from O'Reilly, also a really great read if you're just getting started.
Awesome.